Daniel may seem like a story for Sunday school classes. A lion's den, a fiery furnace, prophecies and miracles, but I see here principles in living in a hostile world. For Daniel, these are incredibly confusing times, as our times are today. Values we considered normal have been turned on end. If we hold to these values, we're looked at as backward or foolish or even intolerant. Is God still in control? The book of Daniel is a great book to show how to live and have an influence in a Babylonian-like culture. 3 different kingdoms were influenced and kings turned around by the life he lived. So let's take a look at the beginning of the book of Daniel. In this video, I'll be covering only the first 2 chapters in the book of Daniel. Let's first get perspective on the time of Daniel. In this you can see where they have King David and then his son Solomon. And then another prophet you may recognize is Elijah. Moving ahead, we have Jonah, Isaiah, and then finally the fall of Judah to Babylon, we have Daniel. So let's get started with Daniel the Overcomer. In the beginning, I'll read from Daniel, the first verse of the first chapter. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. You see, even in the very beginning here, it says that God is in control of who is in control. In verses 3 to 7, we find that the chief of the royal court was to bring the best of the young men, not as slaves, but to immerse them into the Babylonian culture. This involved food, language, and studies, and also a name change. We find that Daniel's name change was from Daniel, which meant God is judge, to Belteshazzar, keeper of the hidden treasure of Bel, another name for the god Baal. Hananiah, which meant Yahweh has been gracious, to Shadrach, a name linked to the Babylonian moon god. Mishael, who is like our God, to Meshach, who is like our moon god. And Azariah, which meant Yahweh has helped, to Abednego, a servant of the Babylonian god of wisdom, Nego. Does a name change have to mean a change in your life? In some cases, name changes made a very positive thing in certain people of the Bible. For example, Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. Jacob became Israel. Simon became Peter. And Saul became Paul. What's important is who God says you are. If people have labeled you as goody two-shoes, or extremists, or intolerant, stupid, or a Jesus freak, when you have accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you have been given Jesus' identity, Christian, which means little Christ. So how did these boys respond to the requirements of a new culture? There's a difference between what God forbids and what we don't like. Daniel accepted his new name and studied the Babylonian subjects, but he drew the line at diet and was willing to accept the consequences. As we read in verse 8, it says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." In verse 9, we now see it says, "Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel." You see, I put in red the words resolved and now God. Daniel resolved first, then God answered. Daniel and his friends were faced with a dilemma, and it can be much like the dilemma you and I face. We live in a world that is growing hostile to our faith, our values, and our beliefs, yet it offers materialistic enticements and sensuous delights. There are things we need to stand firm on in our culture, and we need to define them before we are tested. Know what your response will be to a situation before you are confronted with it. Otherwise, you will be tempted to make the wrong decision when the time comes. Maybe you've been placed in a situation that makes you compromise your faith and beliefs. Unlike Daniel, maybe you can walk away from the situation. And in some cases, maybe you should. But like Daniel, maybe you need to stay. And also like Daniel, you may have an effect on the situation. So now we see in verse 11, Daniel offered an alternative. Maybe this might be something you could try instead of just saying no. Place a time limit and a way to objectively evaluate your option. This shows you are not rebellious. We do not need to be openly confrontational. Possibly by addressing the situation from a practical standpoint, we could offer a better solution to the problem. Daniel's alternative was to be served a different set of foods. Then after 10 days, test them to see how they appear in relation to the ones receiving the royal food. In verse 17, we find that God rewarded these young men with knowledge and understanding and all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. In verse 19, we find that after testing by the king, they were found to be 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. Don't be surprised if God will honor and bless you for standing for him. But then, don't be disappointed if God does not respond the way you wanted. Some time has passed since chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar has dreams that troubled him. Have you ever had a dream that troubled you? Do you try to find out what it meant? Nebuchadnezzar did, and he gave specific instructions. They had to first tell him what he dreamed, and then what it meant. They tried to rephrase his command. They wanted the king to tell the dream first. He responded firmly, and what he said next should really have scared them. He said, "I will cut you into pieces and your houses turned into a pile of rubble." They tried to change the rules one last time, but it didn't work. The king repeated his demands. Then they made an excuse. What the king asks is too difficult. No man can do what the king asks. The king was now angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. Did the king ever think that executing all of his wise men may have not been a smart thing to do? Or maybe he would just get some new wiser men. And also, did Daniel realize that he was speaking to his executioner? Anyway, Daniel spoke with Arioch, which probably shows he was in good standing, maybe by past actions. Then Daniel went to the king and asked for time so he might interpret the dream. Getting the time he asked for also must have shown that his record with the king was good enough to stall the execution. Notice Daniel did not run or hide, or even try to solve the problem by himself. He returned to his house and friends. Now he didn't ask them, so all of them would get together and brainstorm what would be the solution. He didn't ask them for answers either. He asked them to pray. During the night, in a vision, the mystery was revealed. Then Daniel gave credit where credit was due. He praised God. Now Daniel goes to Arioch, who takes him to see the king. When the king asked Daniel if he could interpret the dream, Daniel replied that no wise man can explain it. But here comes the big but, and Daniel gets to give God the credit before the king. And Daniel then gives an explanation of the dream. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell prostrate before Daniel. That means the king fell down on his face before Daniel. This is not what a king does before another person. Can you imagine what effect this had on the others in the court? Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. For you were able to reveal this mystery, said the king. The king then placed Daniel in a high position, ruler over the entire province of Babylon, and placed him in charge of all the wise men, which I'll bet really made them happy. So what could we take away from this? Do you feel you're living in a Babylonian culture? At work, at home, or just in general? And what have you learned from how Daniel thrived in a Babylonian culture that you can apply to your experience? Just remember, One committed believer can make all the difference in the world. One person plus God is always a majority.